for people to realize that, yes, it's George Stephanopoulos' sister. And normally, I don't think that relations with siblings are really factor into the analysis of someone, except that this woman has benefited from George Stephanopoulos' presence, not just in media, but also when he was with the Clintons, because he interceded for her at the State Department numerous times. And that's a fact. There's a paper trail that gets into this. That's a whole separate thing. So she was giving this discussion where she was being asked about, because she's a nun and she was in Gaza, although she's not in Gaza now, but she had, and hasn't been for a while from what I understand, but she previously was. And because she's a nun and because she hates Israel and has a problem with Jewish people, which is evident if you're familiar at all with anything she's ever said or done in her life, because she's been pretty vocal since 2000. That's how long this goes back. A lot of people are just literally like yesterday or the day before is the first time they've ever heard of her. And I've got we're going to deep dive into this. I got a lot of history for you. So a lot of people are just reacting to that, and they're completely ignorant of the stunts that she's pulled in the past. So she does this interview, and because she's a nun, because she doesn't like Israel and she doesn't like Jewish people, and she defends Hamas, oh, well, she's a nun, so you can't disagree with a nun. It's appeal to authority. It's an absolute blatant, elementary logical fallacy. You can't disagree with her because she's a nun. If you disagree with her, you're mocking a nun. If you disagree with her, you're mocking Christianity. I think by holding her up as a representation of Christianity, you are mocking Christianity. That's the first rule. I wanted to play for you, and I have the transcript of the entire interview also. I wanted to play for you one cut in particular that was like pretty much in the beginning of all of this. And you think that people who had any familiarity, or even if they didn't have familiarity with her, after you hear a soundbite like this, you're like, what? This is audio soundbite 25, where she is defending Hamas. And she's saying that October 7th was justified. This is that big O nun that everyone was saying is the measure of whether or not you are a Christian, whether or not you agree with her. And by the people holding her up are the woke right. The people who play into identity politics as much as the left. So listen to what she says here in this interview.
Because I don't think it's Islamic terror that's taking place in the first place. I think we have to disabuse ourselves of that notion that this is a battle between Muslim and Jew. Or that, constantly you heard after the October event was that Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Even to this day we hear it's Hamas, yes. Hamas, Hamas. What is Hamas? Hamas are people who have had their homes taken from them, who, if they live in Gaza, have not been basically been in an open-air prison for certainly the last 20 years going on. Even when the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, they didn't leave open borders. There was no freedom for people in Gaza to develop their economy. If I know people who wanted to try to go to school in America and couldn't get out of Gaza, had a Fulbright scholarship and weren't able to leave.
You mean couldn't get out?
Israel didn't give them permission. So what kind of freedom is that?
Oh, this is so stupid.
If you live in Gaza.
They couldn't even fly out?
No. And their airport had been bombed in 2000 and early on. 2000, there was an airport built soon after.
So this is so asinine. Immediately, she's a simp for Hamas. And again, for the people who say that if you criticize this nun or disagree with her, then you're attacking Christians. If you hold this nun up as a representation of Christianity, you're attacking Christians. Even the devil can cite scripture. So let's make that really clear right out of the get-go. She's immediately getting into all the Pallywood Hamas talking points. Gaza and open air. First off, let's start with the first claim that she was making, that somehow Hamas, they were given a strip of land like the welfare grifters that they are. Israel unilaterally withdrew in 2005. They had free elections. Don't tell me that the elections weren't legitimate either, because then you're contradicting your point on Hamas and Gaza here. No, they had a unilateral withdrawal in 2005. 2007, Hamas took over. And by the way, they had international observers from more countries than I can count on two hands that witnessed all of these elections. And they were there weeks prior and even after, watching everything. They all concluded that these were free and fair elections. Hamas took control of that strip. You have the Palestinian Authority, and I'm not going to get into the PLO and the PA and all that. You had Fatah and Hamas. Those are the two biggest powers. Fatah is essentially holding under a Palestinian Authority, holding it down in West Bank, and then you have Hamas in Gaza. So they were given everything in Gaza: greenhouses, homes, schools, infrastructure, everything. A unilateral withdrawal by Israel. This is undisputed. And what happened after? Hamas assumed control. They had their elections in 2007, and they immediately began cannibalizing their own infrastructure and everything so they could make bombs and they could dig tunnels and they could attack their neighbors. You have entire generations of people brought up to hate other individuals because of their faith. That's what Hamas is. Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But they absolutely are. And they're backed by Iran. They're Islamists. They're zealots. They're terrorists. They're recognized as a terrorist entity by the United States. That is who Hamas is. There is no misunderstanding who they are. And you have someone who claims to be essentially a shepherd for Christ, misleading people. I'm not going to tell you what scripture says about millstones and deep seas on that count. Misleading people on this. Now, George Stephanopoulos' sister here, and remember, her brother has intervened for her many a time at the State Department. There's it's widely reported for anyone who cares to get on this thing called the internet. But what's more is she's pulled stunts before. This isn't the first time she's done it. She pulled a stunt over, there was a story where she was sending emails out claiming a number of different things. Well, she was also justifying Hamas. But she was claiming a number of different things back in 2002, where you had a bunch of suicide bombings, and there had to be a sweep of some towns in the West Bank to root out some of these terror cells because people kept getting killed by these terror cells. And then in Bethlehem, there were a group of terrorist gunmen who seized the Church of the Nativity, and they were there for several days. And they shot at Israeli soldiers who were outside. And then she made up a story and was sending it around everywhere, apparently, an email that was urging, that was claiming that they defecated, that Israeli soldiers defecated in the Church of Nativity on the floors of a Bethlehem medical clinic, that they were shooting at the Church of Nativity. Let's ignore the fact that you had actual terrorists inside of the Church of Nativity shooting at random people and Israeli soldiers outside. She also claimed that they were looting homes and all of this stuff, making all of this stuff up. It was ultimately all debunked. It was all entirely debunked. In fact, Paul Sperry was the reporter that first debunked it. And she even had to admit that she did not witness any of these atrocities. That was Maria Staphanapolous that wrote it. And then later on, Robert Novak cited her as some sort of source of authority when making these claims on behalf of Hamas later. So you see how poisonous this Pallywood stunt is. And it goes back a long time. She is a Hamas apologist. She is a proven serial liar. A proven liar. An apologist for terror. She is not a representation of Christianity, Orthodox or otherwise. Judge them by their fruits. And I am. That's called Christian discernment, and we're called to have it in Scripture. There was some people joked and called her Novak's nun after all of that happened. In fact, Novak made, he was writing he was a columnist, Robert Novak, and he went off on, all kinds, wasn't exactly a fan of, people on the right. And he was sending out emails and letters to people who were apparently defending Israel whenever they had to defend themselves for the millionth time. And he would cite her as an authoritative source, But this is who this person is. And to not even divulge any of that before you sit down and prop her up as some sort of authority on this. And it's an appeal to authority with faith, which I find absolutely demonic. Holding up someone, a proven liar, an apologist for terror, and holding them up as some unquestionable representation of faith is demonic. You don't have to criticize me for that, because I'm just simply revealing to you widely reported accounts of her very publicized, very well-established known behavior. So this is all a major problem. And I made mention of this yesterday on air, and I was really shocked at the idiocy that I saw. I mean, she actually is defending Hamas, and she refuses to call it Islamic terror. And then here she comes back in a later, she's like, no, Hamas, this has nothing to do with America. Audio soundbite 17, please.
We're just flooded with this message that those terrorists are coming to get us next, which is absurd. Has any member of Hamas or anybody of Palestinian come and threatened America as an American? No.
No, they just kidnapped Americans. I guess that's forgotten. In her defense of October 7th, there were a handful of Americans that were also kidnapped. Furthermore, they are the Muslim Brotherhood, backed by Iran. This isn't indisputable. These are all facts. And it just shocks me that none of this is presented. The Muslim Brotherhood is Hamas. And the 88 Charter has declared it is a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is an absolute terrorist enemy of the United States. Now, you want to keep going with the Clinton connection? Let's. So you have George Stephanopoulos' sister defending Hamas/Muslim Brotherhood. It was Hillary Clinton who was and George Stephanopoulos worked for Bill and Hillary Clinton. Not only was he doing comms for Bill Clinton during campaign and also when he was in the White House, but he also worked with the Clinton Foundation. And of course, Hillary Clinton, as you know, backed the Muslim Brotherhood even when they were outlawed in Egypt. She backed the Muslim Brotherhood right before the Green Revolution. She actually backed the terrorist entity in elections in Egypt, which was unbelievable. This is when Hillary Clinton was making a mess of Libya and Egypt and Iran and everything else. Jimmy Carter would have been proud. The only political correctness for a very, very long time prevented the Muslim Brotherhood from being called a terrorist entity. I should know because I started getting involved as a very, very young woman at age 20, 21 in political commentary back after 9/11. And even then, it was, can you remember this? Oh my goodness, it was very sensitive. Ooh, call the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. But they are. It's a terrorist group. They're banned in Egypt. They're related to CARE also, the Council for American Islamic Relations. Everyone talks about AIPAC, but nobody wants to talk about CARE. Ooh, can't do that. What this is a bunch of geopolitical bakabazi that are trying to please their Qatari masters. That's what this interview was. That's what this narrative is. And that's what a lot of people in the woke right are turning into. A bunch of little dancing bakabazi for their Arab masters. That's exactly what this is. At the sake of national security, at the sake of security of our Western allies, at the sake of integrity about their own faith that they claim to uphold. It's very disappointing to see. But I don't know. It's something else, I tell you. I have a lot more on this. And I have a column that'll be coming out this week that gets into it a little bit more. But that is the truth of this matter. And that is who that so-called nun is. Remember, even the devil can cite scripture. And sometimes the devil helps the devil to promote it.